You're listening to Liberty Buzzard with Dustin Hammett and Thomas Umstattd Jr.
Episode 39.
I'm Dustin Hammett.
I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr.
Welcome to Liberty Buzzard, the podcast for inquisitive minds. And today, I think the news is old enough and stinky enough, Thomas, that we're going to talk about the officer shooting in Dallas. Do you want to bring us up to speed?
So in Dallas, a officer who I think she came off a 16-hour shift.
That's the word, yeah.
Came home and went to according to one account of the story, and we'll talk about the different versions of the story. She came home to what she thought was her room, and she had parked on the wrong level of the parking garage in her apartment complex. Walked out on the wrong level. The floors are all identical. She goes to what would be her room. She finds it unlocked. So she's thinking that someone has broken into her room. She finds an African-American man standing in what she thinks is her apartment. She pulls out her service weapon. She fires and she shoots him. Then presumably she turns on the lights. She realizes that unfortunately it was not her room. It was on a different floor. And she has just walked into a man's house who wasn't doing anything and shot him dead. And the other version of the story is that there was complaints about this man because of noise, and she went up there because she was angry and shot him dead. So those are kind of the two different narratives. And what I don't hear very many people talking about is 16-hour shifts. And this, Dustin, I guess this is my first question for you. Is this normal for officers to work 16-hour shifts as a policeman?
So I won't say it's normal, but it's not unheard of. So the problem with being an hourly worker is that you're renting out your time. The problem with being an hourly worker on a civil servant basis is that you do more work and you do a good job at work, and it's not like you're going to get raises. So your pay is very static. And back when I was a cop, and what I tell people about being a cop is you will get a base pay that, depending on where you work, may or may not be a livable wage, decent pay, just doing your normal 40 hours. Where police officers most often make their money is during overtime. So whether that's working, standing outside of a movie theater, or working overtime for the city, because there's always a shortage of personnel out there. People calling sick, people are on vacation, people have to go do this. So most patrol shifts are always short-staffed, and so you're always having to call in somebody to come work overtime. My old department, the Austin Police Department, was there was no mandatory overtime. Well, there was some, but it was very atypical. It was all voluntary overtime. And there was plenty to go around. So if you were one of those people who loved your job, or was financially in a bind, or just wanted the extra money, you could, by policy, this is Austin Police Department policy, work no more than 16 hours in a 24-hour cycle. Keeping in mind that police officers, patrol officers, are shift workers. So you have a lot of people who are working nights. You have people working weekends. You're getting called in the middle of the day. You say, I work 3 years on nights, and you get called in the middle of the day at the last minute to come to a court case. And, you're sitting there for 2, 4, 6, 8 hours, however long, till you get the chance to go on the stand to testify. And then you have a choice. Do I just put all that overtime in my pocket, or do I call in and say, hey, I worked 8 hours, I'm going to take some flex time today, if that is even an option because your patrol shift is short. So long hours, Thomas, to put it shortly, as a police officer are pretty much standard. You're going to have a lot of senior officers out there that have been doing it for a long time, or maybe they have a spouse that makes a lot of money independently and they don't need the money. They don't. But I'd say that's almost more the exception than the rule. Most police officers I know, they will pick up at least one, if not two, if not several. Some police officers work 16-hour days every single day shifts. They'll pick up those extra shifts for the overtime. And I know, since you're going to ask, I'm going to preempt the question, does this result in sleep deprivation? And the answer is absolutely yes. And for those who don't think it's a problem out there, yes, sleep deprivation is an obstacle and a problem for all shift workers. Police officers being, nurses, factory workers, police officers, whoever that is who work night shift. Sleep deprivation is a problem because working at night is not a natural schedule. And plus you get called into court for the middle of the day, all that stuff I've already said. So yes, sleep deprivation is a very big deal. And for those who didn't know this, but I think it's kind of common knowledge now, sleep deprivation, depending on the amount of deprivation you have, can have very similar consequences as being intoxicated on alcohol. If you've been sleep deprived for 24 to 48 hours, you can have the same symptoms as having consumed, 4 or 6 drinks of whatever drink you drink. So it can have the exact same type of symptoms. Let's just say it that way. There's a lot going on behind this story. There's a lot of details that you and I don't know, that nobody out there in the media knows, that nobody knows, that make a big deal of the case, and they're not going to be found out until the case goes to trial if the attorneys are doing their job. The secrecy on the part of those details is it's an essential part of both the prosecutorial side and the defense side. So there's a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot of guessing, and there's a lot of what ifing, but the truth is nobody's going to know, and nobody's really going to know until after the trial is over and after it's all said and done. And I'll put a pin in it there and get your thoughts.
So I want to kind of dig down on this sleep deprivation issue, because I don't think this is the only story. It's not the only aspect of this I want to talk about, but we have very strict rules about airline pilots and how much sleep they have to get before they operate an airplane. They have to get a certain amount of sleep. They have to have a certain amount of downtime. And if you have a long flight that's, going for 10, 12, 16 hours, you have to have multiple pilots so that the pilots can take breaks and rest. And no one is like, no, we shouldn't have those rules for pilots. Pilots should be able to, stay up all night watching, binging Netflix and then fly an airplane while sleep deprived. And yet we are that way with cops. In fact, cops are, allowed and sometimes required to work all of this overtime, which creates a sleep-deprived state. When police officers kill more people every year than airline pilots, like from a sense of risk to the population, police officers are far more deadly than airline pilots. Now, to be fair to police officers, most of those shootings, there's bullets going both ways, and that's their job, is to use deadly force. But if it is your job to use deadly force, you need to be fully in control of your mental faculties. There was a series of commercials that came out a decade ago. They're for Holiday Inn Express. And it was a series of catastrophes that almost happened. One is at the nuclear missile silo. And this guy comes in and he has all the answers and he helps everyone solve the problem. And the nuclear crisis is diverted. And they're like, what department are you with? And he's like, oh, I'm with the tour group, but I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night and I got a good night's sleep. And so I'm able to solve this problem. And I feel like that's what you want your police officers to be, is well rested. And on another side, this seems financially very irresponsible, because Dustin, you get paid time and a half for that second shift, right?
That's correct.
And so if you look at it from a taxpayer's perspective, we're paying 50% more for a tired cop than we do for a rested cop. If we just hired more police officers, we would pay less money, and we'd have more rested police officers, and we could even afford in the savings to give cops a kind of across the board raise, or maybe a merit based raise. I know governments hate, rewarding merit. That's like the last thing a government ever wants to do with paying government employees. But if, let's say we raised all police officers' salaries 10% and hired more police officers and eliminated overtime, or most overtime. Obviously, if there's a riot or something, you may need to call in police officers. But it's just like regular use of overtime seems to be incredibly irresponsible. It's financially irresponsible. It's irresponsible from a public safety perspective. And I imagine it causes burnout. Hey, Dustin, if you hadn't have worked all of those extra shifts and hadn't have had all of that overtime stored up, would you have quit, right? And if you had been paid a little bit more, instead and didn't have to work so much overtime and were able to spend more time with your family as a police officer, would you have stayed? Like, would that have affected that decision?
I mean, I can't absolutely say yes or no. That's a very complicated, nuanced answer, Thomas, about why I left the police department. I would eventually left probably before my 20 years is up, just because I have a lot of interest, and I want to do some different things. And so my original plan was to stay for 10 years, vest my pension, and then take off after that. Ultimately, one of the reasons that process or what that timeline was expedited for me was my personal feelings about the treatment of the police department on behalf of the Austin City Council. I felt they were very disingenuous, and there's no evidence that I have seen thus far that makes me think that the politicians who decide the contract and the fate of the police department as a whole are going to change their tune. So that was one of the big factors in causing me to leave early. If that had never been a problem, if they had ratified the contract as it had been written, and various things like patrol stipends, which encourage patrol officers to stay on patrol, because let me tell you, police officers, the incentive is to not stay on patrol, because that's where you work in full 10-hour days, you work in nights, you work in weekends. You work in holidays, and the incentive is very much, and that's also where most of the risk in this job is, because you are the one in the front line out there interacting with people every single day, and when you interact with people, you're going to interact with the bad ones, and that's where the big risk as far as getting into a conflict with a member of the public comes in. So the incentive is very much to get off the street as fast as possible. So they were trying to ameliorate that by offering incentives to stay on patrol. So we were supposed to get a 5% raise, which over a 5-year period, which I think it was a little bit more than 5%, but it was a very modest raise. Didn't even really keep up with the cost of inflation, and they voted down that contract. To say, had they not done that, would I have stayed longer? Probably. And I think I'm getting a little off the rails here with where you were originally going with this, but. Because we were originally talking about sleep deprivation and being overworked.
Right. So just back to that question real quick. If officers in general, if they weren't required to work as much overtime and were better compensated for the time they did work, do you think turnover would go down?
Yeah. And here's the bottom line for everybody out there who's listening, who's ever been in a leadership position or ever been a business owner or manager where you have to hire people. If you treat your people like crap, you can pay them as much as you want, but eventually they're going to leave. But if you treat your people like crap and you don't pay well, they're going to leave faster. So, police officers in a lot of ways are accustomed to being treated like crap because, when you deal with somebody out in the public and they're angry, they're going to treat you like crap. But when you have to go through that every single day, and you're not getting, what you feel as a fair pay raise, yeah, you're going to leave faster. So, there's a big incentive problem right now with police departments across the United States, and it has to do with a lot of stuff. It has to do with the Ferguson effect. It has to do with the negative way that police departments are being viewed across the country right now, and it's hurting police employment across nations. For people who keep up with this stuff, and most people don't, they're pretty ignorant of it. There's a lot of employment problems with police agencies across the nation. They're having recruiting problems, and they're having retention problems, and it's a little known thing, but it's happening and it's getting worse.
And I think that the shooting in Dallas, you can make the case that it's a symptom of these problems, because the harder you have time retaining, the harder time you have recruiting, the more short-staffed you are, the more you have to encourage / pressure your officers to work overtime. Now, I want to be clear. Her being sleep-deprived does not justify her shooting an unarmed black man in his own apartment. And I want to get back to the race side of this. When we talk about these officer-involved issues, especially shootings like with Ferguson, I always like to look at kind of how can this be prevented in the future, and what are the root causes. And we talked about in Ferguson that part of the reason why people are so angry is that officers are being used as tax collecting or a tax collecting arm of the government, where there's all these fees and people are being put in jail because they can't pay fees, and just like making it a crime to be poor, which disproportionately hurts African Americans, and unjustly so. Like, that is a problem that needs to get fixed, and officers using deadly force is a symptom of this deeper problem of kind of grinding down the poor and using the police to do that, which is also unfair to the police, because that's not why the good ones sign up, and the good ones will leave if that's their job, and you get stuck with bad ones, who don't mind being, bullies on the poor.
So let me offer you a perspective on that, Thomas, because you nailed it. Cops don't become cops to be bad guys. The little kid who dreams of becoming a cop when they grow up, they dream of becoming a cop because they want to be a good guy. And that's why most cops become cops, because they want to be the good guy. And you have, from my very, very microscopic perspective, from my limited time as a police officer in one city, what I saw is that the city wants to use police officers as fix-all, do-alls for all of society's ills. So they task the police department with, being the saviors of the homeless population. They task the police department with being the saviors of the population that is mentally ill. And when the perspective of a street officer, it very much seemed like when society didn't have an answer to a problem, hey, we're going to call the cops to deal with this problem. Let me tell you, that's not always a great solution, because cops deal with criminal matters. We prosecute people who are violating the penal code. And to expand from that, you're asking quite a bit, because what cops have been trained to do is deal with people who are violating the penal code and take them to jail. And so whether it's becoming mental health officers, becoming crisis counselors, becoming marriage counselors, this, that, and the other, one of the biggest tools that we have in our toolbox is to take people to jail. And so, for example, the city of Austin ages ago instituted a no lying or sleeping on a sidewalk policy to combat some of the problems with the indigent population hovering around certain areas. So they enacted the city ordinance. And so when we had homeless camps starting to sprout out and it was starting to get pretty nasty, we used the tool we had in our toolbox and we take people to jail. So all of a sudden, police officers are seen as bad guys because we're criminalizing homelessness. Never mind the fact that this is something that came from the city council. This is something they wanted to be enforced. We don't create the laws as police officers. We enforce them. We use the tools that are put in our toolbox, and we don't make these tools. These tools are given to us by society. So I think you have a big problem with politicians who are representing society, representing the people of a municipality or a county or what have you, saying we don't know what to do with this problem, but we have this big police force that we pay for, so let's use them. And I don't think that's the right answer for a lot of stuff.
And going back to this, again, we don't know the details of this specific shooting. So while we're talking in general about how to make cops better cops by letting them enforce laws that make more sense, the shooting may be details we don't know yet. So, there are differing accounts. Some people say that they exchanged words before the shooting, which I think really changes things. I absolutely think that this officer needs to be indicted and go to trial. I feel like this needs to be hashed out in a trial. The family deserves that. And the fact that she's a cop shouldn't get her off. I think that is a very dangerous precedent to make. If an officer is able to walk into somebody's house and shoot them and kill them and not go to trial, oh my goodness, that's taken us back 100 years of progress, of racial progress. I don't think that's going to happen, though. I think she's going to go to trial, and in the trial, which will be well televised, I assure you, the whole country is going to get to see what happens. The poor jurors in that trial, in that juror box, who I feel bad for already, are going to know that the whole country is watching their decision. And I feel like justice has a really good chance of being done. Injustice tends to thrive in darkness, and there's going to be a lot of light shed on this, right? There's not just the Texas Rangers investigating it. There's not just the Dallas Police Department investigating it. There's going to be a lot of reporters and social media people going around investigating it. The family of the victim has a lawyer, and he's doing work to investigate it, and I've been very impressed with him. And my heart really does go out to this family. My wife has a friend, I think, went to college with the victim, and it's like this was the first time one of these shootings kind of hit home a little bit. We weren't friends with him, but he was within 1 or 2 degrees of separation from us, and it's a scary thing. I mean, I'm not an African American man, but I can imagine it's very scary knowing that a police officer could just come into your house and shoot you. That whole community, there's got to be a chilling effect here that is unnerving.
But I got to stop you right there, Thomas. I got to stop you right there, because here's the thing. I think there is a lot being inserted into this narrative based on race. And I think it's disingenuous, and let me explain why. Like we've already stated, we don't know all of the particulars behind this story. Is it a potential that, the officer is a racist cop and she went in there because she shot him because he was black and we just don't know that part of the story? Sure, it's a potential. I haven't seen any indication of that in the news stories. From what I understand right now, it seems to me like A, she knew him personally and she shot him for a personal reason, or B, she honestly did make just a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake. But nothing that I have seen in this story gives me any indication or warning that he was shot because he was a black man. Am I missing something? Did I miss something there?
I mean, if her account of thinking she's in her room, her own apartment, and it's being burgled by a man and it's dark, I think, and because there's the gender issue here that I think is actually a stronger issue, right? You have a woman who has a man in her apartment. And I will say, I have female family members who live in apartments and who have guns. And if they found a man in their apartment in the dark, breaking in, I could see them being very tempted to use deadly force out of fear of being raped or worse, right? Like that's a very scary position. There's, oh, well, she's a cop, surely she knows how to fight. And there's a saying that if you have people of equal skill, the bigger person wins. So sure, a smaller person with karate skills or kung fu skills could potentially defeat a larger person without those skills. But if all things being equal, the bigger, stronger person wins in a tussle. So you have a 5 foot nothing female who, by nature that she's a female, is going to be weaker, right? Because women, the Venn diagram of women's strength and the Venn diagram of men's strength. Yes, some women are stronger than some men, but most men are stronger than most women. And especially if there's a size differential that it enhances it. Remember when I was in college, we studied, I took a weight training class, and female muscles ounce for ounce actually aren't as efficient, if I'm remembering correctly from 15 years ago in college. So it's not just that they have less muscle mass, they're not as strong. This is why men and women don't compete in the same sports. Don't send me stuff that I'm being chauvinistic here, because I'm really just trying to state science. and this is something that's in the mind of women of I am physically less able to defend myself against somebody who's bigger and stronger. And that may be, again, we're speculating here, and I don't like speculating on this show, but trying to kind of look at this from all angles, what may have been going on. She finds a big, scary man in her room, and that's something she's conscious of. And I will say, as a big, scary man, right, somebody who doesn't know me, I'm very conscious of the fact that if I'm walking behind a woman down the sidewalk, I am making her uncomfortable. And it's not because of my race. It's just because of my size. I'm big and, scary looking to a stranger, especially to a small, strange woman. And so I will often change the way that I walk, cognizant of that, either going slower so they can go forward, or getting around them quickly so that they don't have to be as afraid, or smiling at them, or doing something to kind of set them at ease, because I realize that I have this effect. And that is another aspect of this. So you may be right, Dustin, in that this is not race involved at all. But I will say, if I were a member of the African American community, that's not how I would see it, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not like there have been amazing relations between the police and the African American community for a long time, and this was a statistical anomaly. This is happening in the context of lots of these kinds of shootings, and lots of these kinds of shootings that felt unjustified, and yet nothing was done against the officer. Now, the facts seem to line up very clearly that this was unjustified, and she should at least be charged for manslaughter. I don't know. If there were words, if they had a previous relationship, this might be murder or worse. But I don't know. Those are my thoughts. What do you think?
So this is a very, very touchy subject. And the reason I challenged you, Thomas, is because I think it's very dangerous to impute racism into a situation without any evidence of racism existing, because this is the whole problem of the police world versus the Black community world as it is in America right now. And I think the national conversation and the mood of the nation and the mood of the media, who are, like, as we discussed on the last show, are certainly trying very hard to sensationalize things to sell stories. They want to insert this racism aspect in there. And I think it's disingenuous without evidence of racism being a problem. And I think it's also dangerous. And I think you're doing a disservice not only to the Black community, but also to police officers as a whole, because now you're only furthering a false conception. Just because you're a police officer doesn't mean you're a racist. Just because you've been a police officer doesn't mean you're a racist. But that's kind of the line that's being drawn right now. And so, yeah, I think it's very dangerous. And I think it just goes back to public perception of police officers, and going back to what we were talking about earlier about having trouble hiring police officers. Because now all of a sudden you have this problem of, you put on a uniform, you put on a badge, you put on a gun, now you're supposed to be racist. And I think that's disingenuous. I think it's ultimately unfair to police officers. By the way, as a member of the Austin Police Department, I can tell you that we had human beings of all different shapes, colors, and sizes as members of the Austin Police Department, and we all worked great together. So how is it you're outwardly racist to other? This is from my perspective, outwardly racist to other races, but within the quote unquote thin blue line, you don't see anything. So I think, from my own perspective, I think taken as a whole, the racism aspect is a little overplayed. And so, to impute racism here, I think, is disingenuous. I'm going to comment on what you said about her being a female and shooting a male. One thing there that I think has that I've read, this police officer was in a shooting about a year prior to this, and talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and PTSD and shootings. When you get into a shooting as a police officer, you're going to have some lingering effects in there, especially if you've never done it before. And a part of that PTSD is you're going to be apt to be a little bit more jumpy if you face a similar situation. And I think this is going to have ultimately a large part to play with this case. Because, and this is, again, I'm reading a lot into this without knowing all the facts. And granted, as a police officer, I'm going to have a little bit more sympathy for the police officer. But if this officer, and you take her story at face value, did go in there and got confused and panicked a little bit, I think that's going to have something to do with it. So I think that's important to know. And I think it's important to take into consideration. And I also think it's very important what you said about, facing a larger subject. And if you think you're in your own home, how that's going to affect you. I know I'm going to be perceived as the apologist for the police officer here, and just by the nature of my previous occupation, I do have sympathy there. That said, I want to make it very clear to all listeners out there. I do agree with Thomas in this case that there has to be an investigation. I believe, based on what I know right now, that the investigation is going to lead to an indictment, and that this case is going to have to be seen by a jury. And I don't know what's going to come from there, just because I don't know enough about the case. But just to assume it's racism, I think is wrong. And we really need to know more about the case before we can make an honest to goodness decision about what happened.
All right. Well said. We want to know what you think. Dear listener, feel free to leave us a comment. You can comment on Facebook, you can comment on YouTube, and you can comment at libertybuzzard.com. Are we on base? Are we off base? Let us know. We take all comments right now, friendly and unfriendly. So do leave us a comment. I'm Thomas Umstattd Jr.
I'm Dustin Hammett.
And you've been listening to Liberty Buzzard. This episode of Liberty Buzzard is brought to you by Tom Umstattd CPA. Tom has over 35 years of experience helping people like you pay only their fair share in taxes. Don't let the IRS stress you out. Get Tom and his team on your team at taxmantom.com.